The storm should have killed her. On the coldest night of the year, Daniel Carter, a widowed single dad living deep in the mountains with his 8-year-old daughter, follows his German shepherd into the snow after the dog refuses to stop barking. Beneath a frozen pine tree, they discover a beautiful woman bleeding and barely alive, clutching a broken diamond necklace. She remembers only one thing. Someone tried to kill her, but when Daniel sees her face on the news the next morning, his blood turns cold. The woman sleeping in his cabin isn't a stranger. She's billionaire CEO Victoria Hale, missing for 3 weeks and presumed dead. The mountains in December did not forgive mistakes. Daniel Carter had lived long enough in their shadow to understand that truth the way a man understands scar tissue, not with his mind, but with the deep, dull ache of a body that had already paid the price. He was 38 years old, broad-shouldered and quiet-voiced. The kind of man who filled a doorway without trying to. He had spent 9 years as a search and rescue specialist in the Cascade Range, pulling hikers off cliffs and skiers from avalanche fields, learning the patience that comes from waiting out storms bigger than any one man's will. He had been good at the work, maybe too good it had taken everything from him, and given back very little except the knowledge of how fast the world could turn. His wife, Claire, had died 4 years ago in a highway accident on a January evening while he was home cooking dinner for their daughter. That was the kind of cruelty the universe specialized in. Not grand tragedy, but the senseless, ordinary kind, the sort that left no room for heroism and no villain to blame. So Daniel had packed what remained of his life into the cabin his grandfather had built by hand near Ridgecrest Lake, and he had made a quiet world from what he had left: a cord of firewood, a vegetable patch that barely survived the altitude, and Lily. Lily was 8 years old and already half wild, the way mountain children sometimes became more comfortable in snow boots than shoes, able to name every bird that passed the feeder outside the kitchen window. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and she asked questions so fast that Daniel sometimes felt he was standing still while she moved in 3 directions at once. She was the reason he got up every morning. She was the reason he kept the firewood stacked, and the generator maintained and the radio charged. And she adored Rex with the single-minded intensity only children can sustain. Rex, the German shepherd who had come home with Daniel from his last season of rescue work. A dog built from loyalty and instinct, who slept at the foot of Lily's bed and followed Daniel room to room with the calm authority of something that had decided, once and forever, where it belonged. That night, the wind came down out of the north, like a wall. Daniel had watched it build all afternoon through the cabin's single front window, the sky going from pale gray to iron to a dark, bruised purple that sat too low on the tree line. He had filled the wood box twice and pulled the shutters tight and told Lily they would eat early and sleep close to the fire. By 7 o'clock, the temperature outside had dropped past 0, and the snow was moving horizontally, erasing the tree line, erasing the lake, erasing everything beyond arm's reach. Daniel sat at the table with a cup of coffee gone cold and listened to the storm press against the cabin walls and felt the familiar weight of a night that asked nothing of him but to stay still. Rex did not stay still. He had been restless since sundown, pacing the length of the front room, pausing at the door, going quiet for a moment, and then starting again. Daniel watched him without alarm at first. The way you watch a dog who has heard something your ears have missed. But by 8 o'clock, Rex was no longer pacing. He was at the front door with both front paws against the wood, his body rigid from shoulder to haunch, and the sound coming from his throat was not a bark so much as a command. Daniel stood up. Lily appeared in the doorway of her bedroom with her hair loose and her eyes still slow with almost sleep. "Rex?" she said. Daniel pulled on his coat. He did not know why he trusted the dog's certainty more than the storm outside. He only knew that 9 years of rescue work had taught him to move toward the thing that felt wrong rather than away from it, and everything about Rex right now felt exactly that way. He found her 40 yards into the trees, in a hollow beneath a snow-laden pine where the drifts had built up waist-high on 3 sides. Rex had gone to her unerringly, belly low, nosing at the snow until Daniel's headlamp caught the flash of white fabric against white ground. She was lying on her side with one arm outstretched, and the snow had already begun to cover her, her coat, her hair, the curve of her shoulder, as if the mountain had already decided the matter. Daniel dropped to his knees beside her and pressed 2 fingers to her throat and found a pulse, faint and irregular, the body's last argument. Her face was half buried. He brushed the snow away with his bare hand and looked at her dark hair frozen in thick strands, cheekbones sharp, her lips gone the color of slate, and felt something shift in his chest that he could not name and did not try to. Her left hand was clenched around something, and when he pried it gently open, he found a diamond necklace, the chain broken, the pendant a sharp-edged oval that had cut into her palm. Blood had dried between her fingers. He did not touch the necklace. He folded her hand back around it, gathered her against his chest, and stood. Behind him, somewhere farther back in the dark tree line where the wind had stopped bending branches, and something else had. Rex growled once, low and final, and then fell silent. Daniel carried her back to the cabin through snow that came to his shins and deepened with every step. He did not look back. He laid her on the cot nearest the fireplace and began the work methodically, the way rescue training had taught him: airway first, then circulation, then warmth. He cut away the outer coat and found a wound along her left side, below the ribs, not deep enough to reach the organs but deep enough to have bled freely and long. The blood had dried and refrozen into the fabric of her shirt. Daniel cleaned it with the medical kit he kept stocked out of habit and stitched the worst of it with the precision of a man who had done this in conditions far worse than a warm cabin with firelight. Lily stood at his elbow, handing things without being asked: gauze, tape, a clean cloth, her face solemn with the concentration of a child who understood that something real was happening and had decided to be useful rather than afraid. They changed the woman into dry clothes, one of Daniel's flannels and a pair of track pants Lily found in the bottom of the storage chest, and they wrapped her in every blanket they had and put a hot water bottle at her feet and turned the fire as high as the flue would allow. Then they waited. She came back slowly, the way the deeply cold always did, not a sudden waking but a long, reluctant return, the body testing the air before it committed. Her eyes opened twice in the night and closed again. By 4 in the morning she was breathing evenly, color coming back to her lips, her hands no longer ice at the knuckle. Daniel sat beside her in the wooden chair he had pulled from the table and watched the fire and did not sleep. When she finally came fully awake, it was mid-morning, gray daylight pressing through the window gaps. Lily at the table eating oatmeal and watching her with the frank, open curiosity of a child who had learned that the world occasionally produced surprises worth paying close attention to. The woman lay still for a long moment, eyes moving from the log ceiling to the fireplace, to the child, to Daniel, who was standing by the wood stove with his arms crossed, and his expression as neutral and unhurried as he could make it. Then her breathing changed fast, shallow, the chest rising too quickly, and Daniel took a single step toward her and said, quietly, "You're safe. You're in a cabin. I found you last night in the trees." She stared at him. Her mouth moved. Nothing came. She lifted her right hand and pressed it to her sternum as though checking that her own body was still in order, and then she said, in a voice scraped thin, "What's my name?" It was not a question. It was something worse than a question, a statement of the absence of an answer, offered to a stranger in the hope that he might have the thing she had lost. Daniel held her gaze. "I don't know," he said. "I was hoping you did." She did not. In the hours that followed, she surfaced and sank in turns, the fever doing its slow arithmetic. And what she brought back from each waking were fragments, not memory exactly, but impression, sensation, the shape of something gone, a sound like a single gunshot muffled by snow, the surface of a lake, black water showing through a crazed web of broken ice, and the cold of it like a hand closing around her chest. A man's voice, not close but close enough, and the words, "Finish it." She reported these to Daniel in the evening, with the flat precision of someone dictating a document rather than describing terror. And he listened without expression and wrote nothing down but kept everything. Lily, curled at the end of the cot with Rex's head on her lap, reached over and took the woman's hand and held it without asking permission. The woman looked at the child's hand over hers and something in her face moved, briefly, before she controlled it. "What's your name?" Lily asked. The woman thought for a moment. "I don't know," she said. Lily considered this. "I'll call you Eva," she said, "until you remember." The woman looked at her. "Eva," she repeated, as if trying the word for wait. "All right." Rex, who had not left the cot's side since they carried her in, lifted his head and thumped his tail once against the blanket, as though this settled something. In the days that followed, Eva moved through the cabin's small world, with the careful attention of someone learning a foreign country. She helped with meals, her hands competent at the stove, in ways she seemed unaware of, efficient, clean, the kind of ease that comes from having run something larger than a kitchen. She played chess with Lily in the evenings, and lost badly, and without apparent frustration. She carried firewood when Daniel was outside, and stacked it with a precision that made him pause and look at her hands. Rex did not leave her. He followed her from room to room with the same devotion he gave Lily, pressing against her leg when she sat still, dropping his chin on her feet when she stood at the window and looked out at the trees with the expression Daniel had come to recognize, that particular stillness that meant she was reaching for something just beyond her grasp. He watched her without watching her, the way mountain men learn to observe a landscape for signs of change. She was not who she appeared to be. The way she held herself when she thought no one was looking, straight-spined, utterly still. The composure of someone accustomed to being observed by many people at once. The way she spoke, choosing words with a deliberateness that felt like habit rather than effort. The broken necklace she kept in the breast pocket of the flannel and touched sometimes without realizing it. She was not a woman who had wandered into the mountains on a whim. She was a woman who had been put there by someone who had wanted to make sure she didn't come back out. On the fifth morning, Daniel turned on the small battery-powered television he kept for emergency weather broadcasts. The signal was weak and came and went in static, but the image was clear enough. A news program, a studio anchor, a photograph. He went completely still. Lily was in the back room. Eva was outside on the porch with Rex. The two of them standing in the pale winter sun, Eva's face tilted up like she was trying to remember what warmth felt like. On the television, the anchor spoke with practiced gravity about the continued disappearance of a prominent businesswoman, now entering its third week. The photograph behind her was a professional portrait, a dark-haired woman in a charcoal blazer, composed and direct, looking at the camera with the calm authority of someone who set terms and waited for others to agree. Daniel looked at the photograph. He looked at the door. He looked at the photograph again. The name printed beneath it was Victoria Hale. The news laid it out in pieces, each one larger than the last. Victoria Hale, 41 years old, founder and chief executive of Hale Dynamics, a technology conglomerate with operations across 14 countries, one of the most influential women in American business. Last seen departing her private retreat in the mountains for what staff described as a solo weekend of hiking and solitude, a habit she kept every autumn since the company's founding. Her vehicle had been found 3 days after her disappearance, abandoned on a Forest Service road, 17 miles from Ridgecrest Lake. No signs of struggle in the vehicle. No signs of anything. The story had been running for 3 weeks. The search teams had found nothing, and the tone of the coverage had shifted, in the quiet, professional way it always did after enough time had passed, from missing to presumed. A $5 million reward had been offered by the Hale Dynamics board for information leading to her safe return. There was a quote from the company's chief financial officer, a composed, sharp-eyed man named Marcus Reed, describing his personal anguish at the situation and his unwavering hope for Victoria's safe recovery. Daniel watched Marcus Reed's face on the screen for a long moment. He looked like a man performing grief. The performance was good. It was not quite good enough. He turned the television off. He sat at the table for a long time. Through the window he could see Eva Victoria standing at the porch railing with Rex at her side, looking out at the tree line with that familiar expression. She had been someone, somewhere, before the snow. She had built something enormous from nothing, according to the news. And she had enemies the way enormous things always did. And one of those enemies had apparently decided that the mountains were the cleanest solution, and she was standing on his porch not knowing her own name, with his daughter's blankets on her back and his stitches in her side, and no one who should have been looking for her was anywhere near this mountain. Daniel said nothing to her about what he had seen. He was not certain why. Partly caution, a woman who had been hunted once was fragile in ways that didn't show on the surface, and he had learned in years of rescue work that the wrong information at the wrong moment could send a person back into the shock they had just barely climbed out of. Partly something else, something he did not examine too closely. He began to notice, in the days that followed, that he was not the only one looking at the tree line. That Rex had been restless again at night, in the old way not anxious, but alert. The body language distinction between a dog who is nervous and a dog who has identified something, that the snow on the South Trail, which should have been undisturbed, was not entirely undisturbed. One morning he found boot prints. Single set. Large. Coming to within 30 meters of the cabin and stopping, as if whoever made them had stood there for a while, looking, and then turned back into the trees. Daniel began setting trip lines. He moved quietly about it. In the early mornings while Lily was still asleep, and Eva sat at the table with a cup of tea, and the unfocused expression of someone letting their mind drift towards something it had not yet caught. He did not explain what he was doing. He redistributed the woodpile to give a clear sight line to the south approach. He brought his father's old rifle down from the high shelf, and cleaned it, and put it back where he could reach it quickly. And he watched Eva across the cabin's small distances, and saw her beginning to reach the way her hand would stop mid-air over the chess pieces, not with confusion but with the specific quality of a mind chasing a thought that had almost arrived. She was remembering, not in order, not cleanly. But the fog was thinning. Then one afternoon, a sound she could not have heard came from somewhere above the tree line, a thin mechanical whine, there and gone. She looked up through the window, and her face changed. "There's a drone," she said. Daniel was already at the window. He could see nothing, but the tree line's edge was moving in a way that wasn't wind. "We need to close the shutters," he said. She did not ask why. She pulled the shutters on her side without being told, moving quickly and without noise, and Daniel felt again that she had some history with urgency. Some trained reflex for threat that had survived the amnesia because it lived deeper than memory. That night they came. Daniel heard the snow compress under weight sometime past midnight, and was on his feet before his eyes were fully open. Rex was already at the door, silent and coiled. Daniel lifted the rifle and moved to the wall beside the window and waited. The door latch moved. Then, the door moved. Daniel hit the light and was across the room before the man in the doorway had fully processed that the cabin was occupied and the occupant was already on him. They went through the doorframe and into the porch snow, in a tangle of coats and cold air, and the man was larger than he looked and trained, going for leverage rather than strength. But Daniel had spent 9 years carrying injured people down mountain faces, and his body knew things about leverage that he had long stopped thinking about consciously. He had the man pinned in, under a minute, face down in the snow, arm at an angle that meant cooperation or breakage. The man chose cooperation. Daniel pressed the rifle against the back of his neck and said simply, "Talk." The man said several things before the one that mattered. And when it came, it was flat and certain. The kind of thing someone says when they stop believing in the pretense. She should have died in the lake. Behind Daniel, from inside the doorway, he heard Eva's breathing change. She came back from that moment, slowly and with everything. The memory did not arrive as a gradual brightening, but as a flood, sharp images, voices, the specific physical sensation of cold water closing over her head. She sat at the table for an hour, after Daniel had secured the intruder, and Lily was back in her room, apparently asleep, and she spoke in a low, even voice as though describing something that had happened to another person. Her name was Victoria Hale. She had built her company from a single leased server room in Portland 17 years ago, working from a second-hand desk with a prepaid cell phone and a conviction that the market was wrong about what enterprise infrastructure actually needed. She had been right. She had been right in ways that made her inconvenient to a great many people, and for years she had navigated that inconvenience with the particular skill of a woman who had learned early that being underestimated was a resource rather than an insult. She had trusted Marcus Reed because she had made him. She had brought him into Hale Dynamics when it was still small enough that trust meant something personal, had given him the CFO position against the board's advice, had defended him twice in the early years when he made decisions that looked questionable until they worked. She had not known for a long time how thoroughly he was repaying that trust. The forensic audit findings had come to her 3 weeks before her disappearance. $240 million moved through a structure of shell accounts, so intricate it had taken her internal team 8 months to map it. She had printed the findings, all 411 pages, and she had made an error. She had told Marcus she was going to turn it over to federal investigators on Monday morning. She had gone to her mountain retreat on Friday. On Saturday evening, her car had been forced off the Forest Service Road by a black SUV and down a long slope toward Ridgecrest Lake, and Marcus Reed's hired solution to his problem had stood at the water's edge and watched the car go under, and then gone home to draft his public statement of shock and grief. What Marcus had not known was that Victoria Hale had broken every window of that car getting out, that she had pulled herself across 20 meters of breaking ice on her elbows, that she had dragged herself into the tree line with a gash in her side and 3 cracked ribs before the cold took her consciousness. She had not known any of this herself until now. Daniel listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, the fire had burned low, and the cabin was very quiet. He leaned forward and put another log on without looking at her and said, "What do you want to do?" She looked at him. It was the right question. Not what should you do, not what are you going to do, what do you want? She said, "I want to be sure Lily is safe." Daniel said, "That's already what I want." Something in her face shifted at that, not much, and quickly controlled, but he saw it. They sat for a while in the low light, and Rex lay between them on the floor, and outside the snow had begun again, quiet and absolute, covering everything. On the television the next evening, Daniel turned it on only long enough to check Marcus Reed gave another statement. He stood before cameras with his face arranged in the appropriate configuration of hope and sorrow, flanked by a public relations coordinator who probably billed by the emotion and spoke about what Victoria had meant to the company, to him personally, and to the broader landscape of American innovation. He asked anyone with information to come forward. He mentioned the reward. He looked, Daniel thought, like a man who had just confirmed that a problem he had paid to solve had in fact been solved. He looked like a man who was ready to move on. Daniel turned the television off. He looked at Victoria, who had been sitting very still throughout. She said, "He doesn't know I'm alive." Daniel said, "Not yet." She said, "The moment he finds out, he'll try again." Daniel said, "I know." She looked at him. "We can't stay here." Daniel said, "I have a place." He did an old shelter, government built in the 1980s for backcountry ranger use, 2 miles deeper into the wilderness, reachable only on a route he had mapped himself over a decade of rescue patrols. No road access, no drone coverage through the canopy on that approach. He had provisioned it once, the previous autumn, without any particular expectation of need. It was the kind of thing that felt like insurance until it became necessity. They moved the next morning in the hours before dawn, Daniel carrying the pack and Lily on his back for the steepest sections. Rex ranging ahead on the trail with a focused ease that made Lily whisper into her father's ear that Rex knew the way already. Victoria walked without complaint through the kind of cold that punished breathing. Her face turned down against the wind, the broken necklace tucked close against her sternum. They reached the shelter as the sky went from black to gray, and Daniel got the small iron stove going while Lily and Victoria stamped snow from their boots in the doorway, and Rex shook himself magnificently and went to find the warmest corner. In the days that followed, the shelter became a different kind of small world, from the cabin smaller, closer, with less space between people, and therefore less room for the ordinary performances that usually kept them at a comfortable distance. Victoria learned to read the weather signs that Daniel pointed out, the specific yellow cast of the afternoon light that meant more snow, the way sound traveled differently when the temperature fell below a certain threshold. She was a fast learner. She had always been a fast learner. It was the thing that had saved her in the early years, when there had been no room for the luxury of being slow. Lily taught her gin rummy, and then beat her at it consistently, and with visible satisfaction. Victoria did not let the child win, and Lily seemed to understand and approve of this. They made flatbread on the iron stove and ate it with the canned beans from Daniel's pack, and it was, Victoria thought, the best thing she had eaten in years, which was absurd, because she had eaten in places where the tablecloths cost more than Daniel's truck. And she filed this thought away to examine later. On the third evening in the shelter, Rex was outside, and they heard him bark short, alarm register bark, followed by a child's yell. Daniel was through the door before the sound had fully resolved. Victoria was 2 steps behind him. In the clearing, Rex was between Lily and the edge of the tree line, where a gray wolf stood at the shadow's edge, drawn in by the smell of food, assessing risk. Daniel moved to Lily, and Rex held the line without closing it, placing himself between child and wolf, neither advancing nor retreating, just occupying the necessary space with the absolute authority of an animal that has decided what matters and intends to be sufficient to it. The wolf held for a long moment, yellow eyes moving, and then turned back into the dark. Daniel picked Lily up and carried her inside. Victoria followed and shut the door. Rex came in last and went immediately to Lily and licked her face with a thoroughness that made her laugh. A bright, real sound in the small room, and Daniel looked at his daughter laughing and then looked at Victoria, who was watching them both with the unguarded expression of someone seeing something they had not known they needed to see. She did not look away when he met her eyes. It was a small thing and a large one simultaneously. Daniel held her gaze for a moment and then looked back at his daughter, and the room held something that no one named, because naming it would have asked too much of the moment, and the moment was already full. There are things that happen between people not in the words they say or the gestures they make, but in the specific quality of attention they allow themselves to pay, the decision conscious or not to look away. Victoria had spent 17 years in rooms full of people who looked at her to assess, to calculate, to measure the gap between what she was offering and what they could extract. Daniel Carter looked at her the way he looked at the weather, without agenda, without conclusion, simply registering what was there. It was, she thought, the strangest and most disorienting thing anyone had ever done to her. It was Marcus Reed's ambition that undid him. As ambition of that particular dimension usually did not through miscalculation but through excess. He had tracked the electronic footprint of Daniel's bank account, which had never been hidden because Daniel had never imagined it needed to be, and on a Tuesday morning he sent 2 people to do something that he had decided was both efficient and educational. They burned the cabin at Ridgecrest Lake to the ground. When the story reached the regional news that afternoon, arson, a cabin. A single father identified by his bank records as Daniel Carter, now apparently a person of interest in the disappearance of CEO Victoria Hale. Marcus Reed's communications team had already spent a week building the narrative. Daniel Carter, mountain recluse, isolated, potentially unstable, last seen in the area where Victoria Hale had gone missing. The implication was not made explicit. It did not need to be. Victoria watched the news on Daniel's phone, which they had kept off and battery removed except for these brief checks. The story was well constructed. It would be believed by anyone without access to what she knew. She understood, with the clear-eyed precision that had always been her best instrument, that Marcus was not being reckless, he was being thorough. He had covered the physical evidence, he had constructed an alternative suspect, and he had timed the story to drop before any law enforcement effort could interview Daniel and find her. She said to Daniel, "He's very good at this." Daniel said, "He's not good enough." He said it simply, without posturing, the way a man states a thing he intends to be true. Victoria looked at him. "You can't fight this with your fists," she said. He said, "No, but you can fight it with your head. That's why I haven't tried to do this alone." He handed her the phone. "You're the CEO," he said. "What do we do?" What she did was deliberate, and took 2 days to arrange over the unstable mountain signal. She contacted a former federal investigator she had worked with on a previous corporate matter, a woman named Ellen Marsh, who had left the bureau to run a private forensics firm and who had, Victoria knew, been quietly building a case against Marcus Reed for 14 months from the outside, based on information she had obtained through channels that were entirely legal and entirely invisible to Marcus. Ellen Marsh listened to Victoria on the phone for 4 minutes without speaking. Then she said, "Stay where you are. I have everything I need. I only needed to know you were alive." Marcus Reed made his final mistake on a Thursday evening when his hired men traced Lily to the one careless mistake. Daniel had made a 30-second call to his daughter's school to say she would be absent. They took her from the road at the base of the mountain where the school bus turned around. The man who did it left a message on the number she called from. "Bring Victoria Hale to the old pulp mill at Ridgecrest in 4 hours, or the child stays missing." Daniel received the message and went very still, in the way that mountains were still not empty, but full of something immense and quiet that had decided it was done being patient. Victoria was already standing. She said, "I'll go." Daniel said, "You're not going alone." She said, "Daniel." He said, "Lily is my daughter." Rex found the mill before any of them could find it, on a map following the trail through the dark on the scent he had been carrying since the night on the road. The specific scent of a child who was his and who was afraid. The mill sat at the lake's frozen edge, its concrete walls blacker than the sky, its windows gone, its loading dock hanging over the ice like a broken jaw. Daniel went in from the dock side. Victoria went in from the south entrance she had found on a digital map of the property pulled from county records, moving with the absolute silence of a woman who had spent the last 3 weeks learning to be invisible. She had also, in the previous 2 days, quietly accessed the mill's aging security camera network from Ellen Marsh's remote connection 12 cameras, a patchwork system never fully updated, with a control terminal still live in the foreman's old office. She reached it before Marcus's men knew she was in the building. Daniel moved through the interior by sound and memory of the floor plan Victoria had described: loading bays left, administrative section right. The old process floor straight ahead where the sounds were coming from. Rex moved ahead of him, belly low, choosing paths with a certainty that Daniel followed without question. They found Lily in the foreman's office, locked in, frightened but uninjured, with the particular controlled expression of a child who had decided that being scared was not the same as being helpless. She threw her arms around Daniel's neck with a force that would have staggered a smaller man. He held her for 5 seconds, exactly, then put her behind him and moved to the door. Marcus Reed was on the process floor with 2 men and the portable conviction of someone who had been the smartest person in every room he'd ever entered. When the cameras came on, all 12 of them, lights active, feed routed through Ellen Marsh's servers to a federal task force that had been waiting, staged, 12 miles down the mountain since that afternoon he was mid-sentence, his voice echoing off the concrete floor, detailing, with the awful specificity of a man who believed his audience was captive and temporary, exactly what he had arranged and why. He had not noticed that the cameras were on. He had not noticed that the audio was live. He had not noticed Victoria standing at the back of the room, in a borrowed coat, with a split lip she had caught on the doorframe, and the absolute expression of a woman who had been underestimated one final time. Marcus turned and saw her, and his face went through several things in quick succession. Then he raised the gun he had been holding at his side. Victoria moved first, not toward him, but across the line of fire and in front of Daniel, whose position she had already calculated, and the shot Marcus did not intend to fire went somewhere into the concrete ceiling, while federal agents came through 3 entrances simultaneously. And Rex, who had been waiting in the dark by the east door, made a decision that he communicated only by moving forward. Victoria came out of surgery on a Friday morning with a graze wound along her collarbone that the surgeon described as a centimeter from serious. She woke up in a hospital room with Lily asleep in the chair beside the bed, and Daniel standing at the window, looking out at the gray winter sky, with his arms at his sides and his expression the same it had always been: unhurried, present, carrying more than it showed. She said his name. He turned. The expression didn't change much, but the quality of the stillness in the room did. He came and sat in the chair on the other side of the bed, and they talked for a long time about simple things: the shelter, the flatbread, Rex's performance that evening with the wolf, and neither of them mentioned Marcus Reed, or the board, or the federal investigation that was already, by midday, the most significant corporate fraud arrest in the state's recent history. Victoria went back to Seattle 3 weeks later and did what was necessary with the precision she had always brought to necessary things. The city felt different to her in a way she had not anticipated. Not smaller, exactly, but arranged differently, its distances between things measuring something other than what she had previously assumed they measured. She had always lived in it as a place of work, the streets between the office and the apartment less a neighborhood than a logistics problem to be solved each morning and again each evening. Now she walked them slowly sometimes, in the early mornings before the building filled, and looked at the faces of people moving past her, and thought about what they were going toward and what they were coming from. She did not make this into philosophy. She simply noticed it, the way you notice a change in the light when the season turns, something you had always been surrounded by, and only learned to see by briefly losing it. She reviewed the board, identified the 7 members who had known or chosen not to know, accepted the resignations that were offered voluntarily, and obtained the others by other means. She restructured the executive team. She gave Ellen Marsh's investigation every document it needed, and opened the company's cooperation to the federal process without conditions or caveats. She appeared before the investors and the press on a Tuesday morning and spoke for 22 minutes without notes, and the room was very quiet throughout. She did all of this with the competence of someone doing her job because it was her job. But in the evenings, alone in the apartment that suddenly felt like something that had been built for a different person's life, she thought about a small iron stove and a dog's head on her feet and a child's voice asking her a question she did not know how to answer. She thought about what it felt like to be known by the things you did when no one was deciding whether to be impressed. She went back to Ridgecrest Lake in late April, when the snow had begun to melt at the edges and the tree line was showing the first pale green of new growth. The cabin was gone, she knew that, had known it since November, but she had heard, through the careful intelligence network she maintained, and that now included a primary school secretary who had become, in the way of small mountain communities, central to local information, that Daniel was rebuilding it. She found him in the clearing, working alone, the frame already up, and the roofline half done, moving with the deliberate efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he was building and had allocated the correct amount of time and energy to each part of the task. Rex heard her first and came across the clearing in a low, joyful run, tail going, and she went down on one knee in the mud and let him hit her with all the enthusiasm of a dog who had decided, once and permanently, that she was his. When she looked up, Daniel was standing at the edge of the frame with a hammer hanging loose in his hand, watching her. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I figured you'd be back in the spring." She said, "I figured that too." He nodded at the frame. "You want to help?" She looked at the half-built cabin and then at him. "Yes," she said. Over the following months, she helped build it. Not continuously, not every weekend. She had a company to stabilize and a board to rebuild and federal proceedings to cooperate with. But she came when she could, and she learned what she was shown, and she discovered that there was a specific pleasure in constructing something with her hands that had nothing to do with the scale of the outcome. Lily appointed her chief assistant on the planter boxes that went on the south side of the new cabin, a project of considerable horticultural ambition for that altitude, and they worked on it together in the long summer evenings while Daniel made dinner, and Rex went from one to the other in his endless, loyal circuit. Victoria had hired a new CEO for Hale Dynamics by August, someone she had known for years and trusted completely, and in September she submitted her own resignation from the board. She kept a minority stake sufficient to protect the company's direction, and gave the rest in a structured charitable distribution to 3 organizations she had been meaning to fund for years and had never prioritized over the next quarter's numbers. The announcement made news for a day. Then something else made news, the way something else always did, and Victoria Hale's retirement from the industry she had built became simply a thing that had happened, quietly as she had always preferred the real things to happen. By the following December, they were back at Ridgecrest Lake. The new cabin was done a little larger than the old one, better insulated, with a prop window on the south wall that let in the winter light at a low angle that turned the interior walls gold in the afternoon. The wood box was full. The generator was serviced. Lily had grown 2 inches over the year and had developed, in addition to her existing expertise in birds and card games, a serious interest in wilderness medicine that Daniel viewed with the mix of pride and alarm that fathers develop when they see their children choosing the same difficult thing that cost them the most. Rex was slower now, his muzzle going white at the edges. But he still slept at Lily's feet, and he still moved to the door when something at the perimeter needed checking, and his authority in the cabin remained absolute and uncontested. On a late December evening, with new snow falling outside in the particular soft way it fell at Ridgecrest, Daniel took Victoria's hand and led her to the lake's edge. The ice was solid, and the snow fell on it without a sound, covering their tracks as fast as they made them. He said what he had been moving toward, saying for a year with the same patient deliberateness with which he moved toward everything, not rushing it, not dramatizing it, just bringing it into the light when the moment was sufficient. He asked her. She said yes before he had finished the question. They stood at the edge of the ice where the water was black in the spaces the snow hadn't reached yet, and held each other in the cold without speaking, which was enough. Lily found out at dinner, and expressed her opinion about it at length, and with characteristic intensity. Rex accepted the news by getting up from his spot by the fire and going to lie between them, which was his way of endorsing arrangements he considered correct. A year after that, Daniel opened the mountain rescue center he had been planning. Quietly. Since his last season of formal rescue work. It operated out of a building at the base of the Ridgecrest Access Road, with a staff of 6 trained volunteers, and a response capacity that covered the range of terrain that had always been served by no one. Victoria funded it in its entirety under a trust structure that kept her name off the organizational documents because she had learned, or perhaps always known, and only recently prioritized, that the best things were the ones you built for their own sake and then stepped back from and let stand on their own. The center's call sign, chosen by Lily and supported by unanimous household vote, was Rex 1. On an evening in the 2nd January of that life, Lily came in from feeding the horses they had added to the property, and took her coat off and sat down beside Victoria on the floor where Victoria was brushing Rex's winter coat with the slow, repetitive care that Rex accepted as his natural due. Lily leaned her head on Victoria's shoulder and said, with the directness of a child who had decided something and saw no reason to circle around it, "Mom, it was the first time." Victoria kept brushing. She did not trust her voice immediately and did not try to use it. Rex's tail moved against the floor. After a moment, Victoria put her arm around Lily and held her. And outside the window the snow fell on the lake and on the trees and on the mountain that had almost kept her, and she understood, with the clarity that only the nearly lost truly achieve, how far she had traveled to arrive at this particular ordinary evening. She had built a company worth $4 billion. She had rebuilt it after it was nearly destroyed. She had navigated federal investigations and board reconstructions, and the specific sustained exposure of having your trauma become public property. She had done all of it with the competence she had always brought to difficult things. But sitting on the floor with a dog's warm weight against her leg, and a child's head on her shoulder, and Daniel's voice coming from the kitchen, where he was making the soup, that was Tuesday's soup, always. In this house, she understood that none of those things had required her to be known. And that being known was, it turned out, the thing that she had been working toward all along, without ever having named it. Later that evening, after Lily had gone to bed, and Daniel was reading in the chair by the fire, and Rex had arranged himself across both their feet with the completeness of a dog who has settled a matter to his satisfaction, Victoria said, to no one and both of them, "If he hadn't found me that night, I would have died before learning what love really feels like." Daniel did not look up from his book immediately. Then he set it down and looked at her. He said, he knew. Victoria looked at Rex, whose ears moved at the sound of their voices, whose tail made its single slow sweep against the rug. She thought about 40 yards of frozen trees and a blizzard, and a dog who had refused to be still, who had stood at the door and commanded attention until someone followed. She put her hand on Rex's back and felt the steady warmth of him, the immovable fact of his presence. Outside, the snow was falling on Ridgecrest Lake, and the mountain stood in its dark patience, and the small family inside the rebuilt cabin let the fire burn down slowly and did not hurry toward the end of the evening. Because there was no hurry anymore, and the absence of hurry was itself the whole of the gift. The thing she had worked 17 years to be too busy to receive.